Hey guys, tonight we drift into a place where the sand holds heat even after sunset, where the river moves like a long exhale, and where you, yes, you, have somehow signed up for the night shift at a Nubian bakery that's been standing here longer than some empires managed to stay upright. You're probably squinting already, trying to make out the shapes in the half-light, and wondering why everything smells faintly like roasted grain and warm clay. And honestly, you probably won't survive this if you're expecting modern AC, ergonomic shoes, or even a clear job description, because ancient Nubian bakers ran on stamina, superstition, and whatever handful of roasted millet they remembered to eat before dawn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and the local time in the comments so we can all see who's baking desert bread together tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the gentle glow of a dying desert evening, toes sinking slightly into warm sand that still remembers the sun. A low mud brick wall rises beside you, its surface smoothed by generations of hands, some careful, some careless, all just trying to get through another long shift. This structure isn't a house, and it isn't a temple. It's the bakery, or at least the closest thing to one in a world where architecture is half practicality, half guesswork. You feel the dry breeze press against you like a warm blanket, carrying the earthy scent of grain and the river's faint mineral tang. Your workstation, if you can call it that, is nothing more than a palm mat laid near the kiln, patterned with scorch marks from people who stood too close while trying to get warm on cold desert mornings. A small clay pot sits nearby, filled with a slurry of grain that will eventually become something edible. Eventually is the key word. You dip a finger in and instantly regret it. It's sticky, gritty, and has the consistency of porridge that someone abandoned halfway through cooking because they remembered a better life choice. A Nubian baker shuffles past you, giving you a sympathetic but amused look, the kind you give someone about to learn an unpleasant truth. He's wrapped in a linen cloth that looks older than your entire modern household appliance collection, and moves with the slow efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times. Without saying a word, he gestures toward the riverbank, where the last of the daylight bleeds into shimmering bands of bronze and lilac. Time to gather water before full dark. No, there's no bucket with a handle, just a clay jar that's heavier than it looks. Congratulations. As you trudge toward the water, you hear frogs croaking, one of the few night sounds here besides the occasional distant bray of a donkey who sounds like it's having a minor existential crisis. You kneel, dip the jar, and wait for the sediment to settle. And as you do, the scene widens around you. Acacia trees standing like patient guardians, reeds whispering against the bank, and the deep velvet sky already pricked with early stars. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. Nubia, after all, was home to some of the world's earliest riverine agricultural communities, thriving on the Nile's dependable floods, long before grand monuments were ever imagined. That fertile strip of land made baking not just possible, but essential.
But tonight, as you stand ankle-deep in cooling mud, something else tugs your imagination. A quirky tidbit the older baker mentioned earlier. According to local tradition, the best bread rises only when the first star visible after sunset is the one locals call the bread watcher, a faint speck near the horizon. Supposedly, if clouds hide it, the dough stays stubborn and the loaves flatten like disgruntled pancakes. Whether this is charming folklore or just a collective excuse for bad humidity days remains unclear. Jar-filled, arms aching, you return to the bakery. The kiln, your anchor for the night, stands like a small dome against the darkness, its outer surface glowing faintly from the residual heat of the earlier bake. You kneel beside it, feeling warmth radiate into your shins. The older baker is already mixing grain and water in a larger clay bowl, using gestures so economical they border on poetic. He nods at you to join, and so you plunge your hands into the mixture. It feels sticky but alive, shifting slowly, stubborn in some spots, cooperative in others. You knead, fold, press, repeat. A scholarly debate nudges into your thoughts. Historians still argue whether Nubian baking leaned more heavily on millet, barley, or early forms of emmer wheat during certain periods, since archaeological evidence varies wildly depending on which settlement you examine. You glance at the grains in your bowl and realize with mild helplessness that you're probably participating in the argument right now without meaning to. Congratulations! You're now researching data. The rhythm of kneading settles into something almost meditative. The older baker hums a quiet melody under his breath, something cyclical, maybe meant to keep pace. The clay walls hold the sound gently, cradling it instead of echoing it. You feel your mind drift just a little, carried by the warmth, the darkness, the weight of the desert night pressing softly around you. And then, like a mischievous interruption, your modern brain whispers a totally unhelpful thought. At least you don't have to clean a stand mixer tonight. That's joke number 1, your hourly ration. Over time, your shoulders loosen. Your breathing slows. The dough begins to take shape, smoothing under your hands. The baker nods approvingly. Maybe you're not terrible at this after all. He sprinkles a pinch of salt. Not too much because salt isn't exactly abundant here, and gestures for you to continue folding. The smell is earthy, comforting, and somehow both ancient and familiar, like the scent left behind after baking cornbread in a cast-iron skillet. A few other bakers wander over, exchanging a few soft jokes among themselves, the kind that don't need full laughter, just a shared smile. They're preparing the kiln for the next firing, adjusting the fire pit, checking the airflow, and tapping the clay walls softly to listen for tiny cracks. You catch one joking that the kiln has a temper like a jealous wife, which earns a quick elbow from his colleague. Joke number 2, delivered by history, not you. You notice the stars again, more of them now, sharp and cold against the ink-black sky. The temperature drops, the sand cooling beneath your feet. And there you are, hands covered in dough, breath fogging lightly, kneeling beside a clay oven in one of the world's oldest cultural landscapes, feeling very small and very timeless all at once. A third small joke escapes you as you rotate the dough. If this goes badly, I'm blaming the bread watcher star. The older baker snorts, which is possibly the highest form of ancient approval. And as the dough becomes smoother and the night deepens around you, something changes. You're no longer just watching history. You're in it, elbow-deep and grain-smudged, part of a chain of bakers stretching back thousands of years.
You ease forward from the warm glow of the kiln, still feeling the dough's memory lingering on your palms as the older baker waves you toward the grain hut, a low, rounded structure half buried in sand, like it's trying to hide from the desert winds. You duck inside, and immediately the air shifts, cooler, drier, holding the dusty perfume of stored harvests. If you were expecting orderly sacks lined up like a modern pantry display, you're in for disappointment. Here, grain lives in clay bins, woven baskets, and whatever containers survived last season's termites. It's a miracle anything stays edible. You brush your fingers over the lip of a basket filled with millet. Tiny, bright, almost golden seeds that catch the lantern light like little flecks of sun. These grains are the backbone of Nubian bread making, partly because millet is a stubborn overachiever that survives where wheat throws dramatic fits and dies. A mainstream historical fact floats up. Ancient Nubians cultivated multiple hardy grains, especially millet and barley, because the desert margins demanded resilience more than culinary versatility. You roll a few kernels between your fingers and marvel that something so small kept entire communities alive through years when the Nile forgot to behave. The older baker taps your shoulder and points to another container, this one storing emmer wheat. It's coarser, almost flaky, and smells faintly sweet. He scoops some into your palm, then pinches it thoughtfully between his thumb and forefinger. You can tell this grain is precious. He handles it the way you'd handle a kombucha starter in a Brooklyn apartment, cautiously, like it might judge you. Wheat here is special, almost ceremonial, and often reserved for festivals, temple offerings, or families with more resources than yours would probably ever have. You follow the baker's gesture toward a darker corner where clay jars line the wall. These hold barley, earthy, slightly bitter, and essential for thick porridges and occasionally early beer brewing. That earns a moment of appreciation from your modern self, because even in ancient Nubia, nothing motivated the human spirit quite like the promise of fermented beverages. You think, for one split second, about asking how long it takes to make beer, but the baker's expression suggests this is not the night to start side quests. A quirky little fact surfaces in your mind, one you half recall from a documentary you fell asleep to. Some Nubian farmers sprinkled ash over grain storage bins because it kept insects away and allegedly sweetened the harvest spirit. Whether the ash did anything besides make the grain taste faintly like campfire popcorn remains dubious, but it was a tradition carried with cheerful confidence. You scan the baskets now and, yep, there it is, a thin gray dusting. You hope no one expects you to taste test that later. The baker kneels and begins measuring grain with a smooth, practiced motion. 2 handfuls of millet, 1 of wheat, 1 of barley. It seems random at first, but soon you see the pattern. Nubian bread wasn't about strict recipes. It was about adapting, improvising, and making do with whatever the river and soil decided to grant that year. Historians still argue whether specific grain ratios were culturally standardized or changed drastically from village to village, mostly because evidence is uneven and ancient bakers were too busy keeping everyone fed to leave detailed notes.
You scoop the grain mixture into a large bowl and carry it outside, where the desert night has fully wrapped itself around the settlement. Lanterns flicker along the courtyard, casting soft halos over the sand. The other bakers have gathered near a wooden platform, really just an elevated slab of planks held together by hope and rope, where grains are sifted to remove pebbles, husks, and whatever else snuck in. You take your place beside them, grabbing a woven sieve that looks suspiciously like it was repurposed from someone's grandmother's laundry day. You pour the grain through the sieve in slow cascades, letting the moonlight guide your hand. A soft whisper of falling grain fills the air, almost hypnotic. Tiny stones dance across the mesh, pinging lightly before bouncing off into the sand. The bakers work beside you in easy rhythm, their movements as synchronized as a team of baristas during morning rush hour, just quieter and less caffeinated. As you sift, the older baker leans over and murmurs something that sounds like advice. He taps your wrist, tilts the sieve slightly, and suddenly the grain flows more evenly. You mimic the angle, and he nods. You feel weirdly proud, like you finally unlocked level 2 of the ancient bread skill tree. Joke number 1 for this section sneaks into your thoughts. At this rate, I'll have enough XP to unlock not burning the loaves. Once the grain is clean, it gets poured into a stone mortar where a younger apprentice waits with a wooden pestle almost as tall as he is. He gives you a grin, part invitation, part challenge. You take the pestle. It's heavier than you expect, like lifting a gym dumbbell made out of stubbornness. You raise it, bring it down, and instantly understand why ancient bakers probably had arms like Olympians. The grains crack under the pressure, releasing a warm, toasted smell. The apprentice joins you, and the two of you fall into a steady, alternating rhythm. Lift, drop, grind, breathe. It's shockingly soothing, like a physical metronome that keeps time with the night. Overhead, the sky deepens to indigo. A breeze swirls past, carrying desert chill across your back. The mortars thump in near unison from across the courtyard, a heartbeat of communal work. As you grind, the older baker explains, mostly through gestures, the harsh limits of desert agriculture. Grains had to be harvested quickly, dried even faster, and stored in sealed jars because humidity was the enemy. Too much moisture meant rot. Too much heat meant the grain dried into something resembling edible gravel. Balancing these conditions was less science and more art, guided by observation, instinct, and sometimes pure stubborn hope. Your arms begin to ache, but the apprentice grins wider, clearly enjoying your slow descent into muscle fatigue. You deliver joke number 2 to lighten the moment. If this doesn't make my shoulders look like a granite statue by dawn, I'm asking for a refund. The apprentice snorts so loudly he nearly loses his rhythm. Eventually, the grain becomes coarse flour, soft enough to shape, rough enough to hold texture. The baker tests it with a pinch, rolling it between his fingertips, nodding with approval. You feel a small swell of triumph, like someone awarded you a gold star in ancient bakery class. A quiet conversation hums around you, bakers discussing tomorrow's harvest, the possibility of late floodwaters, and whether the storage jars need patching. You catch another quirky tidbit. Apparently, one baker swears that singing to the grain before grinding makes the flour finer. Another says that's nonsense, and the real trick is flattering the mortar so it doesn't chip out of spite. You're not sure whether either practice works, but the argument is gentle, almost affectionate. As you tilt the fresh flour into a clean bowl, the older baker pats your back with a firm, approving hand. The grains are ready. You've made it through another step of a process older than most written languages, guided not by instruction manuals, but by hands that learned from other hands long before you arrived. And beyond the courtyard, the desert stretches in silent admiration, as though even the dunes know the value of this work.
You carry the bowl of flour toward a low, circular bench where the night's mixing will begin. The surface is worn smooth by thousands of batches, each one leaving a ghost of motion behind. Presses, pulls, scoops. You set the bowl down, and the older baker gestures for you to sit. There's a kind of hush here, not silence exactly, but a focused calm, like the kitchen of a diner right before the morning rush. A clay jar sits nearby, half covered with a linen cloth. When the baker lifts it, a warm, slightly sour scent floats out. It's starter, fermented dough, alive in that bubbly, unpredictable way that reminds you of every sourdough craze your friends went through. Except this one isn't Instagram famous. It's been fed for generations, passed down like a living family heirloom. A mainstream fact comes to mind. Many ancient baking traditions relied on naturally fermented starters long before the idea of commercial yeast existed. It was a delicate process, dependent on the invisible work of wild yeasts drifting through the air. You dip your hands into the mixture and let you feel the texture, sticky but elastic, warm from its own tiny biological party happening inside. It breathes, he seems to say, without actual words. You nod, pretending you understand, but deep down, you're marveling at the idea that desert bread owes its airiness to microscopic freeloaders just drifting around waiting for carbs. Next comes the water, which is far more precious. A ceramic jug arrives in the hands of the apprentice, and he holds it with reverence, not the dramatic, let me photograph this reverence of a modern coffee drinker, but genuine appreciation. Desert life taught everyone that water isn't a resource, it's a character in the story, temperamental, moody, and not always cooperative. You watch as the baker measures the water by feel, not by cup. His fingers know more than any recipe could tell. He pours a thin stream into the flour,
moving so slowly you'd swear he's preparing an ancient chemistry experiment. Maybe he is. Historians still argue whether Nubian bread depended more on instinct or standardized technique, whether recipes were carefully guarded knowledge or something all households shared freely across generations. You dip your hands into the mixture and begin turning it gently, the way you were taught a few minutes ago, circling from the edges inward, letting the flour drink the water. It starts clumpy, awkward, resisting your attempts like a toddler refusing bedtime. But eventually it yields, forming a soft, malleable mound. You lean your weight into it, pressing it forward, folding it back, and something shifts. The world narrows to the quiet rhythm of kneading. Your fingers move without thought, guided by the dough's subtle responses. It's strangely meditative. Even the desert wind seems to pause and listen. Joke number 1 arrives on cue. You know, for something that ends up as bread, this dough has some sass. The apprentice snorts again, nearly spilling the water jug. As the dough evolves, smooth, supple, pleasantly cool, it begins to stick to your hands. You try to shake it off discreetly, but the baker catches you and chuckles, tapping a bowl of oil. Ah, lubrication. Suddenly, it all makes sense. You smear a little oil on your palms, and the dough behaves, slipping gracefully instead of clinging like an affectionate cat.
A quirky tidbit floats into your thoughts. Some Nubian households supposedly mixed a pinch of ground date pits into dough, not for flavor, but because they believed it encouraged warmth in the oven spirit. Whether this warmth referred to luck, actual heat, or just a nice crust, no one seems to know. You glance at the apprentice to see if such stories are still alive here. He shrugs, then mutters something that sounds like, "Can't hurt." The dough reaches its perfect consistency, firm but elastic, and the baker nods with satisfaction. He reaches for a small wooden tool, really just a carved paddle, and presses it gently into the top of the dough, making a shallow pattern. You've seen similar markings in museum pieces, decorative grooves on ancient loaves. Here, though, they serve a simpler purpose, helping the dough cook evenly while adding a little flair. The apprentice sprinkles coarse salt over the top. The grains glitter, catching the lantern light like tiny stars. Salt here is a luxury, carried across long trade routes by merchants who risked heatstroke, bandits, and sandstorms. You think of your modern self casually tossing salt into pasta water with zero appreciation, and guilt pokes you gently in the ribs. As you knead again, the dough begins whispering subtle cues. The stretch beneath your palms, the air bubbles forming, the quiet stick-roll pull of fermentation. It's oddly musical. You joke number 2. If dough could gossip, this batch would have a lot to say. The older baker gives a rare grin. Eventually, the mixing becomes communal. 2 more bakers join, working in slow, synchronized motions around the bowl. It feels ceremonial, hands weaving together, palms moving in a loop of shared effort. You follow their rhythm until the dough is transformed into something soft, cohesive, and surprisingly patient. The desert air cools further. Your breath forms faint puffs as you lift the dough, folding it onto itself one last time. A breeze drifts through the courtyard, carrying the scent of acacia from a distant fire. Stars shimmer above like tiny witnesses. The baker motions for you to place the dough in a clay bowl lined with a warm cloth. You set it down gently, feeling a strange parental pride. The cloth wraps around it like a blanket. It will rest now, fermenting slowly, alive with microscopic energy. While it sits, the bakers talk quietly, sharing bits of knowledge that aren't written anywhere.
One mentions how humidity shifts the dough's mood. Another explains how a warm stone placed beside the bowl helps during cold seasons. A third claims that dough rises better if you hum while working beside it. You test that theory with a soft hum. The apprentice leans over and whispers, "It only works if you stay in tune." You throw joke number 3. Well then, we're doomed. Minutes pass. The dough puffs slightly, rising with quiet determination. You touch its surface lightly. It springs back just enough. It's ready for shaping. You lift the bowl and breathe in its warm, tangy scent. The mixture of flour, water, salt, and starter feels like the first hint of magic, the prologue to the bread that will soon sustain the whole community. And as you carry it toward the shaping bench, you realize that this step, sticky hands, careful water use, gentle kneading, is the heart of the entire process. It's where the ingredients stop being separate things and begin becoming something communal, nourishing, and deeply human.
You walk toward the clay oven, carrying the gently puffed dough in your arms. The desert night stretches silently around you, and even the stars seem to pause, watching with faint curiosity. The oven itself is a dome of mud and straw, squat and unassuming, yet it hums with a quiet, patient energy. You can feel its warmth radiating against your arms and chest as you set the dough down on the nearby preparation table. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. Mud brick or clay ovens like this, called tanures, have been used across Africa and the Middle East for thousands of years, prized for their ability to retain heat long after the fire has dimmed. The older baker wipes his hands on his linen wrap and gestures toward the oven. He begins inspecting it carefully, knocking and tapping on the clay surface, listening to the low resonance. You follow his movements with interest, noting how each gentle tap produces a subtly different tone. A scholarly debate pops up. Historians still argue whether Nubian bakers intentionally designed the wall's thickness and shape for precise acoustics, or whether that was simply a lucky consequence of trial and error construction. Either way, it's hypnotic, the way he circles the oven like a quiet conductor, coaxing the kiln into readiness. The smell of residual smoke drifts toward you, slightly sweet from last night's acacia wood and faintly pungent from bits of camel dung fuel. Yes, camel dung. The older baker gives a wry glance when you wrinkle your nose at the aroma. You probably won't survive if you expect modern air fresheners in this place. But the quirky truth is that different fuel sources subtly flavored the bread, and some bakers preferred the smoky sweet undertone camel dung provided. You make a mental note never to complain about your gas stove again. A small fire crackles inside the oven, coaxed by long sticks of acacia wood that burn with gentle orange light. The older baker fans it lightly with a palm mat, creating soft flickers of heat that ripple across the sand. He instructs you to add a few pieces of dried reed for extra aroma. They hiss as they meet the fire, filling the courtyard with a faint, grassy perfume. You lean close to inhale, and the warmth curls across your cheeks. Joke number 1 pops into your mind. Nothing like toasted reeds to remind you that dinner is serious business. You kneel to examine the interior of the oven. It's empty except for residual embers and a faint layer of ash, the perfect canvas for tonight's bake. You notice that the oven's surface is uneven in places, with tiny bumps and ridges that might seem imperfections to a modern eye. But here, every bump serves a subtle purpose, guiding airflow or retaining pockets of heat. The apprentice points these out to you quietly, and you nod, feeling like you've been let in on a minor ancient secret. Next comes the ritual of shaping the loaves. The older baker rolls a small portion of dough into a rough oval, then presses it flat, tapping it gently to coax out air bubbles. He demonstrates, moving his fingers lightly across the surface in a pattern that seems both purposeful and spontaneous. You copy him, pressing and folding, feeling the resistance and softness beneath your palms. There's a rhythm, a gentle dialogue between your hands and the dough that almost lulls your thoughts into quiet.
You place the first loaf on a slightly oiled clay paddle, ready to slide it into the oven. The apprentice fans the fire a little higher, and the heat rises like a living thing, eager and impatient. Joke number 2 drifts through your mind. If this loaf could talk, it would probably yell, "No pressure!" The older baker glances at you and smirks, a faint line of amusement breaking his usually calm demeanor. Sliding the dough into the oven is both terrifying and exhilarating. You hear a soft hiss as the hot surface meets the moist dough, and a faint aroma begins to rise immediately. The loaf clings briefly to the clay, then releases, settling into its new home. You step back, letting the oven absorb your nervous energy as it begins its transformative work. Meanwhile, the night deepens around you. Other bakers rotate loaves in the oven, adjusting positions to ensure even cooking. You notice the soft cracks forming in some of the older crusts, tiny imperfections that actually improve the overall bake. It's a lesson in patience and humility, one you silently accept as you watch the process unfold. Historians still argue whether these subtle irregularities were intentional or simply natural consequences of clay oven dynamics, but you decide they add charm anyway. You take a moment to listen to the oven itself. The heat hums softly, the embers crackle faintly, and the entire courtyard seems wrapped in a quiet cocoon of warmth and aroma. It's a lullaby for bakers and dough alike, a gentle reminder that bread making is as much art as sustenance. Joke number 3 creeps into your mind. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the oven had opinions about tonight's loaves. Hours of careful attention follow. You rotate loaves, monitor heat, adjust embers, and even fan gently to encourage even baking. Each movement is deliberate but slow, almost meditative, and the subtle sounds of sand shifting, reeds crackling, and dough puffing form a nocturnal symphony. By the end of the session, the oven has transformed raw, sticky dough into warm, fragrant loaves, ready to nourish the community and continue a tradition as old as the Nile itself.
You step back from the glowing dome of the tanur and inhale deeply, letting the layered aromas wash over you. There's something fundamentally reassuring about the smell of burning acacia and dried reeds mixing with the warm, faintly sour scent of bread already forming inside. This combination, while unusual by modern standards, was the hallmark of Nubian baking. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. In the Nile region, wood, reeds, and animal dung were common fuel sources, carefully selected not only for availability, but for the subtle flavors they imparted to bread. The bakers treated their fuel as ingredients, just like flour or salt, each choice influencing the final taste. You move closer to the stack of small wood pieces and dried camel dung, which sit beside the kiln like loyal companions waiting their turn. The older baker gestures toward them with a serious expression that doesn't match the gentle humor in his eyes. You gather a handful of acacia sticks, feeling their brittle texture and faintly resinous scent. Joke number 1 crosses your mind. I never thought I'd be handling firewood like a Michelin star sous chef. He smirks knowingly. Lighting the fire is delicate work. Too little and the oven won't reach baking temperature. Too much and you risk scorching the loaves before they've had a chance to rise. You arrange the fuel carefully, layering sticks and small clumps of dung for optimal airflow. The smell of the first small flames curls into your nostrils like a warm, teasing invitation. Quirky tidbit. Some Nubian bakers claimed that lighting the fire at a particular time in the evening, synchronized with the river's whisper and the position of certain stars, would encourage bread luck. Scholars still debate whether these rituals held practical thermal benefits or were purely symbolic, but you hum along anyway, just to be polite.
As the fire grows, you watch the heat rise inside the tanur, its walls glowing faintly, holding the warmth like a patient guardian. You rotate logs carefully, watching the embers take on a deep orange glow. The smell evolves, now tinged with earthy sweetness from reeds and a subtle smokiness from the dung. You try to imagine the flavor these different fuels might impart to the bread. A mild, almost imperceptible nuance, invisible to the untrained palate, but revered by those who grew up on this aroma. Nearby, the apprentice is fanning embers, guiding smoke up and around the oven to ensure even heat distribution. It's a quiet choreography. Each motion is slow, precise, and deliberate. You join him, waving a mat with soft sweeps, feeling the warmth tickle your fingertips. Historians still argue whether these gestures were practical measures to optimize heat or more ritualistic, designed to keep the oven happy, but the loaves respond as if approvingly. You notice how each fuel source behaves differently. Acacia burns cleanly, releasing a faintly sweet aroma. The dried reeds sizzle and crackle, emitting hints of grassy perfume. Camel dung burns more slowly, radiating warmth long after the visible flames fade. Each layer contributes to a subtle complexity in the bread's final flavor. You adjust your pile of fuel slightly, feeling like a conductor orchestrating a quiet, fragrant symphony. Joke number 2. Who knew loaf flavor depended on your choice of livestock leftovers?
The heat itself seems almost alive, moving around the oven in gentle waves. You press your hand near the exterior, not too close, just enough to feel the warmth seep through the clay. It's steady, forgiving, and patient. Unlike modern ovens, which enforce exact temperatures, this one requires you to read it, sense it, and anticipate the needs of the loaves inside. There's a tactile intelligence here, something built into centuries of repeated practice and intimate observation. Meanwhile, the scent of smoke mingles with the growing aroma of the fermenting dough resting nearby. The combination is intoxicating in a quiet, understated way. You watch as the baker moves effortlessly between tending the fuel and checking the dough's readiness, adjusting embers with delicate taps and fanning motions. His movements suggest a kind of slow, practiced meditation, each action performed with awareness and gentle humor. As the oven reaches the perfect baking temperature, you notice tiny wisps of flame licking the edges of the clay dome. The older baker nods at you, signaling that it's time to slide the first loaves in. You position the paddle, gently coaxing the dough onto the glowing surface. There's a faint hiss, a soft crackle, as the dough meets the radiant clay. The scent of caramelizing crust immediately begins to rise, mingling with smoke and embers in a heady, comforting aroma. You step back, watching the loaves swell and puff in the oven. The colors shift subtly, deepening to a warm golden brown. Joke number 3 surfaces quietly. "I've never felt this invested in something so doughy." You chuckle softly to yourself, aware that the night is still young and there's much more to tend. Fuel, heat, and the slow, gentle magic of baking that fills the courtyard with both warmth and the softest sort of suspense.
You take a step back from the oven, letting the warmth of the kiln wash over your shoulders as you catch your breath. The courtyard is quiet now, except for the soft crackle of embers and the distant whisper of the Nile flowing under the starlit sky. You notice how the bakers move in a rhythm that feels almost ritualistic. Slow, deliberate, imbued with gestures that seem both practical and quietly ceremonial. A mainstream historical fact, in Nubian culture, baking was not merely functional. It often carried ritual significance, from the timing of the work to the small gestures and prayers whispered over the dough. The older baker picks up a small bundle of herbs, leaves you've seen drying along the riverbank during the afternoon, and lightly brushes them across his hands before kneading another batch of dough. You raise an eyebrow. Quirky tidbit, some bakers swore that brushing specific herbs over the hands imbued the bread with protective qualities, keeping spirits, or maybe just pests, at bay. Scholars still argue whether these practices were practical pest deterrents or more symbolic gestures. But either way, the smell is unexpectedly pleasant, earthy, and calming. You reach for a new mound of dough, letting your fingers sink into its warm, elastic surface. The apprentice hums a low, rhythmic tune that echoes softly off the clay walls. You join in softly, realizing that hums and chants were believed to influence the dough's texture, a minor superstition that, if nothing else, helped maintain focus. The rhythm is hypnotic, a gentle lull that guides your hands as they fold, press, and stretch the dough. Joke number 1 drifts into your thoughts. If this loaf could talk, it would probably request a lullaby. Nearby, the older baker sprinkles coarse salt and a few grains of roasted barley over the surface. You watch as he presses it gently into the dough, creating faint patterns. Mainstream history reminds you that such surface patterns served multiple purposes: practical scoring to prevent bursting, aesthetic enhancement, and subtle identification of household or baker. Quirky tidbit: in some communities, bakers believed that drawing specific symbols on the dough encouraged better fermentation. Historians still debate whether this was ritual, practicality, or a mix of both, but the loaves respond with a slow, satisfying swell that seems to approve of the gestures. The night air drifts around you, carrying the scent of embers and rising dough. You take a moment to breathe in deeply, noticing how the flavors and aromas layer together: smoky, earthy, faintly sweet, and wholly grounding. There's a tactile poetry in rolling, pressing, and shaping the dough, something that turns each loaf into both sustenance and narrative, a story made of flour, water, and quiet attention. A group of women bakers joins the circle now, moving in and out with baskets of additional grains and starters. Their presence is steadying, almost maternal, as they gently guide novices through kneading techniques and oversee small rituals before loaves enter the oven. One woman murmurs a prayer over a particularly stubborn batch of dough, invoking the Nile's blessings and the spirits of past bakers. You watch closely, impressed by the blend of care, ritual, and practical skill. You take the next mound of dough and fold it carefully, pressing a soft thumbprint in the center before gently rounding the edges. The apprentice adjusts the heat in the oven slightly, careful not to rush the rising process. You watch as steam begins to escape from the dough's surface once it is placed near the kiln. There's an almost imperceptible sigh, a soft exhalation as if the bread itself is settling into its warm, protective home. A scholarly debate comes to mind. Historians still argue whether Nubian bakers intended such tactile gestures primarily for practical reasons, ensuring even cooking, or whether they carried deeper cultural or symbolic significance. Either way, you feel part of the continuum of tradition, hands coated in dough, senses attuned to subtle cues of rising and readiness. You notice the apprentice whispering to a loaf in a mock-serious tone, pretending to offer encouragement. Joke number 2 forms immediately. Well, if motivational speeches worked for dough, I might finally believe in self-help. The older baker chuckles softly at this, though he maintains the calm discipline of his watchful eye. By now, the courtyard is filled with the quiet hum of preparation, the soft patter of hands shaping dough, and the fragrant, rising aroma of bread. Each loaf, each movement carries a gentle, almost hypnotic cadence, connecting you to a lineage of bakers who measured success not in speed,
but in patience, presence, and care. You can feel a slow sort of satisfaction building. Hands sticky, arms weary, heart quietly attuned to the subtle music of a centuries-old craft. The last loaves are carefully shaped and laid aside, ready for their final journey into the tanur. You take a moment to appreciate the patterns of night, the glow of the embers, the whisper of the river, and the quiet, almost reverent energy of the bakers. This is their world, and you are welcome, even if only for a few hours, to participate in its steady, nurturing rhythm. Joke number 3 slips into your mind softly. If bread making were an Olympic sport, I'd at least win for enthusiasm. And as you lean back, letting the warmth and quiet settle around you, you realize the night has a rhythm of its own, a slow, deliberate pulse shared between bakers, dough, and desert alike. The rituals, prayers, hums, and gentle motions blend into a seamless tapestry, where every loaf is a testament to endurance, subtle artistry, and communal care. You approach the clay oven again, carrying the last batch of shaped dough, its surface still soft and yielding under your palms. The tanur glows warmly, a muted orange radiating through the dark courtyard, offering comfort and guidance. The older baker gestures toward the embers with a subtle nod, signaling that it's time to place these final loaves inside. A mainstream historical fact rises into your awareness. In ancient Nubia, bakers carefully controlled the timing of placing the dough into the oven to ensure even cooking and optimal crust formation, a process that required both skill and intuition honed over generations. You slide the first loaf into the oven using the wooden paddle, feeling a soft hiss as it meets the hot clay surface. The apprentice adjusts embers with gentle precision, guiding heat across the oven's interior. You lean close, inhaling the faint, smoky perfume that rises immediately, a combination of acacia, reeds, and the subtle tang of starter. Quirky tidbit, some bakers claimed that speaking kindly to the loaves as they entered the oven improved their behavior while baking. Whether true or not, the soft ritual brings a calming rhythm to the courtyard. Historians still argue whether these verbal gestures had practical benefits or were purely symbolic, but you join in anyway, whispering, "Do your best, little loaves." You watch as the dough begins to swell and respond to the heat, the edges browning gradually while the interior puffs with gentle determination. The older baker gestures for you to monitor the color, tapping lightly on the oven's exterior, listening for subtle variations in resonance. There's a language here, one made of sound, touch, and observation, honed over centuries. Joke number 1 creeps in. Who knew baking could double as auditory meditation? Nearby, the apprentice fans a gentle breeze toward the oven entrance, encouraging an even distribution of heat. Tiny sparks lift and twist in the air, catching the lantern light as if dancing to a rhythm only they can hear. You pause for a moment to watch, entranced by this quiet, almost magical ballet. The combination of light, warmth, and scent is oddly hypnotic, coaxing your thoughts into a soft, meditative state. As the loaves bake, the older baker shares a subtle secret. He picks up a small brush and gently sweeps flour dust over the upper surfaces, a technique meant to encourage a slightly crisp crust. Mainstream fact, this technique, common across several Nubian settlements, allowed bakers to create a desirable textural contrast while protecting the softer interior. Quirky tidbit, some families believed a light dusting of flour invited good spirits to watch over the bread during its transformation. Scholars still debate whether these flower patterns served symbolic or strictly practical purposes, but the effect is undeniably charming.
You rotate a paddle of loaves carefully, moving them deeper into the oven as the heat fluctuates. Your fingers tingle from proximity to the warm clay, but the sensation is pleasant, like a gentle hug from the earth itself. The courtyard is hushed, filled only with the soft patter of hands adjusting loaves, fanning embers, and the occasional whispered instruction. Joke number 2 drifts into your mind. I came for bread, but I think I'm getting a master class in desert ASMR.
Time stretches. The loaves puff, crack slightly, and develop golden patterns on their surfaces. You press your hand lightly against one that's almost ready, feeling its warmth radiate into your skin. Each loaf seems to breathe, expanding slowly, reminding you that baking is not just a chemical reaction, but something almost alive. The older baker nods approvingly at your observation, and you feel a small surge of pride. Meanwhile, the apprentice hums a quiet tune, one that echoes across the courtyard, mingling with the soft crackle of embers and distant whispers of the Nile. The melody has no words, but seems to harmonize with the life of the dough itself. Quirky tidbit: some ancient bakers swore that specific rhythms, when hummed during baking, encouraged uniform rising. Historians still argue whether this was effective or merely a comforting superstition, but it certainly adds an enchanting dimension to the process. As the first batch of loaves is removed, the warm, aromatic air envelops you, carrying the faint sweetness of baked grains. You notice the subtle color gradations, golden edges, slightly darker centers, the soft cracks on the surface revealing the dough's tender interior. The older baker places them carefully in a woven basket to cool. Each loaf feels like a small, living monument, evidence of patience, skill, and the quiet artistry of generations. You step back and breathe deeply, letting the rich sense of smoke, grains, and warm bread saturate your senses. Joke number 3 surfaces quietly. I never thought a loaf of bread could smell like victory. You glance around the courtyard, the soft glow of lanterns, the rhythmic movement of bakers, the faint rustle of the desert wind, and realize that this moment is more than baking. It's a slow, gentle celebration of continuity, survival, and the small, magical rituals that make life sweet in even the harshest environments. By the time the last loaves are sliding from the oven, the courtyard is alive with a quiet, contented hum. Each movement, each breath, and each small gesture has contributed to this communal achievement. The bread, still warm and fragrant, stands as a tangible connection to the past, a reminder that patience, care, and a little gentle magic can transform humble ingredients into nourishment and delight.
You follow the older baker to a low, stone-lined table where the loaves rest, their warm surfaces sending faint waves of steam into the cool desert night. The aroma is intoxicating, a blend of nutty grain, faint smoke from acacia embers, and the subtle tang of naturally fermented starter. You lift one gently, feeling the warmth radiate through your fingers. A mainstream historical fact: Nubian bakers often used locally grown emmer wheat and barley, which gave their bread a distinctive, slightly coarse texture compared to the finer flours of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The choice of grain dictated not only taste, but the bread's resilience in the dry climate. You notice the older baker scoring a loaf lightly with his thumb, leaving soft indentations along its surface. Quirky tidbit: some households believed that pressing a pattern of dots or lines into bread would guide its energy and influence the day's fortune. Scholars still argue whether these practices had actual symbolic intent or simply helped the bread bake evenly, but the effect is visually appealing and undeniably comforting. Joke number 1 drifts into your mind. Who knew bread could moonlight as a fortune cookie? The apprentice carefully arranges the loaves in a woven basket, making sure they have space to cool evenly. You lean closer, feeling the gentle rise and fall of steam as the warm loaves release it into the night. There's a quiet rhythm to the courtyard now. The soft hiss of cooling bread, the occasional crackle of dying embers, and the rustle of linen cloths as bakers adjust coverings. The sound is hypnotic, lulling you into a serene awareness of each delicate moment. You pick up a loaf and tap it lightly with your knuckle, listening to the hollow, reassuring sound. It's a tactile confirmation that the baking is complete and that the interior has achieved the proper texture. Mainstream fact: Nubian bakers relied on such tactile and auditory cues because they lacked thermometers and modern timing devices. Their hands and ears were instruments, finely tuned to detect subtle changes in dough and crust. Nearby, the older baker slices a small wedge from a loaf, revealing the golden, slightly porous interior. The aroma intensifies, a subtle mix of warmed grains and fermented starter. Quirky tidbit: some families claim that tasting the first slice before sunrise brought good luck, a tradition that combined practical quality control with gentle superstition. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or limited to particular households, but the gesture adds a delicate layer of intimacy to the baking ritual. You break off a small piece and feel the loaf's soft resilience. The flavor is mild, earthy, and slightly sweet, a testament to careful fermentation and the interplay of grains, water, and heat. You chew slowly, letting the texture and aroma fully register. Joke number 2. This is basically edible patience, and I think I earned it. The apprentice grins, nodding in agreement, while the older baker watches with quiet approval. You notice the way light from the fire and lanterns glints off the crust, creating faint golden highlights. Each loaf seems to have a subtle personality, shaped by minor variations in temperature, placement in the oven, and moisture content. The differences are small but meaningful, a reminder that baking is both science and art. You gently press another loaf, feeling its elasticity and noting the faint warmth still radiating from the oven.
The night air is cool now, carrying with it the scent of river reeds and faint smoke. You and the bakers move slowly, arranging baskets and covering the remaining dough with cloths to continue fermentation. Quirky tidbit: in some Nubian villages, leftover dough was sometimes kneaded into small figurines or tokens, either for ritual purposes or simple amusement. Historians still debate whether these creations were symbolic or merely playful experiments. But the idea of dough doubling as miniature art intrigues you. As the last loaf cools, the courtyard takes on a hushed reverence. Every movement has softened into a gentle cadence, rotating baskets, brushing crumbs, adjusting cloths. You lean back and inhale deeply, allowing the interplay of aromas, warmth, and soft sounds to seep into your consciousness. Joke number 3 surfaces: I came for bread, but I think I've gotten a crash course in desert aromatherapy. The older baker gathers everyone near the central table, motioning for a final communal inspection of the loaves. Each baker touches a few, feeling their texture, observing subtle crust variations, and exchanging quiet remarks. It's a slow, meditative affirmation of the night's labor. You feel the gentle pull of tradition here, a sense that every loaf is a bridge between past and present, a tangible expression of patience, skill, and cultural continuity. You sit quietly, watching the warm bread cool, the stars flicker overhead, and the Nile whisper in the distance. The loaves are more than sustenance. They are a living history,
a subtle narrative of hands, fire, and devotion that has endured through generations. You realize that every inhale of aroma, every touch of warm dough, and every gentle hum during baking has created a shared rhythm connecting you to centuries of bakers who lived, laughed, and labored under the desert sky.
You settle beside the long wooden bench where the bakers gather after the final loaves have cooled, the night stretching calm and deep around you. The stars glitter overhead, sharp, unwavering points of light against a velvet black sky, while faint currents of wind stir the linen coverings over the remaining dough. Here, in this quiet space, you begin to notice the people who truly shape the Nubian baker's world, the women whose hands memorize dough without ever needing measurements, the young apprentices who learn by watching long before touching, and the quiet masters who speak rarely but teach constantly. A mainstream historical fact: in many ancient Nubian households, bread making was primarily managed by women, whose roles in food production formed the backbone of daily survival. Their knowledge wasn't written, it was transmitted through gesture, rhythm, and repetition. You watch as one woman, her hair wrapped in a light cloth, kneads leftover dough with steady, practiced strength. Her movements are methodical but gentle, as though she communes directly with the dough itself. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. Some communities believe that experienced bakers could predict a family's fortune by how smoothly the dough came together under their fingers. Historians still argue whether this was genuine divination or simply an early form of stress testing the humidity and flour quality. But either way, the belief added a layer of mystique to the baker's craft. A young apprentice sits beside you. Their eyes flick between your hands and the older baker's movements, absorbing everything silently. You can almost feel their eagerness humming in the air. The apprentice nudges a small bowl toward you and whispers, "Try kneading again, but softer this time." Joke number 1 arrives gently. Imagine getting baking advice from someone whose age you can still count on your fingers. You do as asked, pressing your palms lightly into the dough, letting your fingers experience its elasticity and warmth. The apprentice nods approvingly, not a big nod, just enough to let you know you're not entirely hopeless. Across the courtyard, the older baker chuckles, the sound crackling like subdued embers. Another woman leans over, showing you a subtle trick, wetting your fingertips with a bit of cool water before smoothing the edges of the dough. This encourages a more even surface during rising, preventing small cracks. Mainstream fact: Nubian bakers commonly used water not only to hydrate dough, but also to shape and seal seams before baking, ensuring a more uniform loaf. She demonstrates the motion, slow, deliberate, almost meditative, and you mimic her, feeling the dough respond in small but important ways. Nearby, a traveling baker, an itinerant expert who moves between settlements during harvest seasons, sits cross-legged, sharpening a wooden peel with a flake of polished stone. His hands are weathered, the kind of hands that have known thousands of loaves, thousands of fires, thousands of mornings at the river's edge. He glances at you with a faint smile, offering only a few words. Clay remembers. Fire listens. You nod, pretending you understand, while joke number 2 whispers, "Great, now the oven is sentient."
But in a way, you sense what he means. Baking here isn't a simple task. It's a dialogue between water and grain, between hand and dough, between heat and shape. Each person in this courtyard contributes a different tone to that conversation. Women knead with inherited confidence. Apprentices observe like wide-eyed scholars. Traveling masters bring new methods or forgotten tricks. And you, well, you're trying not to drop anything. As the night deepens, the bakers gather around a low clay basin filled with warm river water infused with crushed herbs. They wash their hands slowly, letting fatigue melt into the soothing warmth. A quirky tidbit, in some Nubian households, bakers wash their hands with herb-infused water not only for cleanliness, but to wash away unlucky dough. Historians still argue whether this ritual had symbolic meaning or was a practical method of reducing flour buildup on the skin, but either way, the scent of crushed mint and desert flowers fills the air and feels undeniably calming. You dip your hands into the basin. The warmth is heavenly after hours of kneading, shaping, and adjusting embers. You can feel the tension ease from your fingers, as though the water itself appreciates your effort. The apprentice laughs softly when you sigh with relief. "Harder than it looks, right?" they say. You nod solemnly. Joke number 3 murmurs, "At this point, even my blisters need a nap." On the far side of the courtyard, 2 experienced bakers sit shoulder to shoulder, repairing a cracked paddle with thin strips of leather. Their hands move in perfect synchrony, looping, pulling, tightening. They barely speak. Years of shared labor have carved an unspoken language between them. You sit quietly and observe, marveling at the intimacy of work born from necessity. A soft breeze rustles the palm frond canopy overhead, stirring shadows across the ground. The Nile's distant voice threads through the night, a low, steady murmur that seems to breathe with you. The bakers gather around baskets of finished bread, discussing which loaves will go to households, which to market, and which will be kept for morning meals. Mainstream fact, bread distribution in Nubian communities often followed a structured pattern, with loaves allocated according to family size, social roles, or temple obligations. The system kept food flowing even in harsher seasons. You listen as women discuss subtle differences in texture and color. Apprentices learn which loaves fetch better trade value, and the traveling baker offers a quiet suggestion about oven patching. You feel woven into their world now, not by expertise, but by presence and willingness. The night deepens, lantern light softens, the courtyard breathes a long, collective exhale. You look around the circle of bakers, the quiet experts, the watchful youths, the women whose hands carry centuries, and you realize that bread is not merely food here. It's a cultural heartbeat, rising and falling with each generation, shaped by hands that rarely claimed recognition, yet sustained countless lives.
The sky is still undecided when you finally step outside. Not dark, not light, just a soft, diluted gray that feels like it's still thinking about what it wants to be. Behind you, the clay oven releases its last warm breaths, tiny waves of heat rolling into the quiet street. You've spent the whole night with it, tending the fire, shaping the dough, listening to the small crackles that kept you company. Now the shift is ending, and you're holding the final loaf. Warm, soft, still humming with the memory of the fire. This is always the moment that makes the night feel real, the walk toward dawn with the last loaf in your hands. Outside, a small wooden counter waits by the doorway. Nothing fancy, just a plank balanced on 2 uneven legs, but to the people of this town, it is the promise of morning. One by one, the first customers appear, older women wrapped in shawls, mothers with half-asleep babies, workers with tired eyes, already bracing for another demanding day. You hand them their loaves quietly. No one talks much. At this hour, words would feel too sharp for the soft air. Bread becomes the whole language. A mother adjusts her child on her hip as you place a warm roll in her basket. A ferryman takes his loaf with hands calloused from years of pulling ropes through river water. The stonecutter nods a thank you without lifting his gaze. You don't mind. Everyone understands that mornings begin slowly here. When the line finally ends, the sky has brightened into a gentle silver. A single bird calls out, as if testing whether dawn is ready to hear it. You step back inside to gather the imperfect loaves, the ones too small, uneven, or misshaped to sell. They receive their own little ritual. Some will go to the children who run through the alleys at sunrise, laughing with the kind of energy that hasn't learned tiredness yet. Some will go to the old man who never has enough coins, but always repays with stories that feel older than the town itself. And some pieces you leave by the back door for the birds, even though you never watch them eat. It's nicer to imagine the fluttering and the tiny grateful tilts of their heads. Now that the bakery is empty, you sit on the low stone step outside. Your wrists ache from kneading. Your shoulders still carry the heat of the fire. But this quiet moment always feels sacred. You breathe in slowly. The world is waking up somewhere far away. But here, everything is still soft, still gentle, still unhurried. You think about what the night really was. Hours folded into dough. Silence shaped into bread. Darkness warmed into nourishment. Bread making is its own kind of endurance, a quiet survival, a service that happens while others sleep so they can wake believing that bread simply appears. But you know the slow hours that go into each loaf, the patience, the timing, the heat that feels like it settles into your bones. You know that even though your work disappears by noon, eaten, torn, forgotten, it leaves behind a softness in the day of whoever receives it.
As you sit with the last loaf beside you, you think about the bakers who came before. Your grandfather, who listened to storms while kneading dough. Your grandmother, who stretched flour during shortages so no child went hungry. Their hands must have known this same warmth, this same rhythm, this same quiet purpose. Bread is older than languages, older than borders, older than many stories told in books. And tonight, once again, it passed through your hands. A small breeze slides through the street, and the bakery's familiar nighttime smell begins to fade. The warm yeast, the toasted grain, the smoky sweetness of the fire. It always vanishes first thing in the morning, dissolving into the day as if the night never happened. No one walking by in an hour will know the world of work, heat, and ritual that lived here while they slept. Your labor is remembered only in a loaf meant to disappear. But that's all right. That's how this craft has always lived. Quietly, invisibly, faithfully. The sky shifts from silver to the faintest gold. You rise slowly, brushing flour from your arms even though some of it will cling until midday. You take the final loaf in your hands and begin the walk home, each step softer than the one before. The night is behind you. The day is waiting. And somewhere soon, someone will break apart the bread you shaped and unknowingly taste the hours you lived in silence.
The light continues to soften as you walk, stretching itself gently over the rooftops, edging into the narrow alleys that still hold traces of night. You can feel the world waking at its own slow pace, the way the desert always prefers, never rushing, never forcing anything into sharpness too quickly. Your footsteps fall into a rhythm, loose and unhurried, and the warmth of the loaf in your hands sinks deeper into your palms, becoming a kind of quiet reassurance. As you move further from the bakery, the sounds begin to thin out until even the faint rustle of morning breeze feels distant, as if it's deliberately softening itself for you. Each breath you take comes longer, smoother, drifting in like warm air through a window left open for comfort.
The night's work releases its grip on your shoulders, melting away in slow, steady waves. You feel each muscle letting go, as though your whole body has been waiting for permission to rest. And the world seems to recognize this. It adjusts around you. The air cooler, the light gentler, the silence stretching wider. You can almost picture yourself from above, a small figure walking through a half-lit ancient town, the last glow of the oven still clinging faintly to your clothes, your hands holding on to a loaf that will soon be part of someone else's morning. It's a peaceful image, something soft enough to slip into, like easing your head onto a pillow that's already perfectly shaped to you. The breeze carries the last remnants of the bakery scent, thinning them out until they barely linger. Warm grain, a little smoke, a memory of yeast. They fade in the same way thoughts fade before sleep. Slowly first, then all at once. You let them drift away, knowing the scent will return again the next night when the fire awakens and the dough rises in its quiet bowl. For now, all that matters is this gentle slope downward, this long exhale that leads you to stillness. You keep walking, but your steps grow softer in your mind, as if the path beneath you becomes pillowy, cushioned by sand and silence. Your eyelids feel heavier, the way they do after long hours of warmth and concentration. The heaviness isn't demanding, it's an invitation, a soft hand guiding you toward rest. Thoughts blur around the edges, their shapes rounding, loosening. You imagine the world shrinking to the rhythm of your breath, the slow movement of your chest, the quiet pulse in your palms. Everything else fades, the market stalls, the distant river, even the sun that is still deciding how bright it wants to be today. All of it slips gently out of focus. You find yourself thinking about how many nights like this have passed, how many bakers across centuries have walked home in this same softness, feeling the same release, the same tiny swell of pride that comes from feeding a community while the rest of the world sleeps. Their stories drift through time like flour in the air, light and quiet and always settling eventually. You are part of that now, part of a long line of hands that shaped dough, tended fire, and greeted dawn with quiet dignity.
And knowing that allows another layer of tension to fall away. Another breath slows, another thought softens. Ahead of you, the morning light becomes even gentler, spreading out in long golden threads that look almost like they're weaving a path for you. You don't need to follow it consciously. It guides you simply by existing, a glow that invites you to let go of whatever is left of the night. You imagine setting down the loaf, imagine washing the last traces of flour from your hands, imagine lying down in a cool, shaded room where the walls still remember the night's chill. The image settles over you like a blanket, warm enough to comfort, light enough to lull. Your breath continues to lengthen, smoothing into a slow, steady tide. In with the last warmth of the oven, out with the dust of the desert roads. In with the calm of a night's work done, out with everything you don't need to carry anymore. The world narrows now, gently, kindly. The light softens further, the air still grows. And whatever fragments of thought remain start to dissolve into something peaceful, something quiet, something that feels very much like sleep settling in around you. So let the warmth fade slowly from your hands. Let the softness of the morning wrap around you. And let yourself drift easily, effortlessly, into the rest you've earned.
End of script. Sweet dreams.